there's an awful lot about it that has kind of enduring fascination for people. Whether or not the operators were competent, an accident was almost always going to happen. I would say that Chernobyl was really a kind of a catalyst for the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union. There's a list of things that were to be kept secret. Number one was the real causes of the Chernobyl accident. This kind of accident, certainly on this scale, could never happen in another reactor like that again. I think there's a lot of reasons. I think that part of it is that radiation itself, the nature of radiation, ionizing radiation, is kind of has a really firm hold on people's imaginations because, you know, it's invisible, intangible, it has no taste or smell, and yet is a potentially lethal force. I mean, it's all around us all the time anyway. But under certain circumstances, for example, you know, if there's an accident in a nuclear power plant, it can unleash forces that can kill you without you even having any sensation of anything having changed. So it has a sort of a supernatural element to it. It seems deeply uncanny and is therefore very frightening. And I think that people are kind of fixated on it partly because of that. But also the way in which the Chernobyl accident took place, you know, not only under circumstances of great secrecy behind the Iron Curtain, but also because it affected the entire population of Pripyat, the town that was built to house the workers of the plant and their families, which was so close. It was only, at its closest, it was 3 kilometers away from the plant itself. And you know, therefore, it affected not just the people who were at the plant and the first responders who went out to deal with the accident, but everybody who lived in the city. You know, it had to be completely evacuated. And I think that there's a lot about the accident that's similar to the Titanic disaster, the sinking of the Titanic. You know, Walter Lord, who wrote this fantastic book about the Titanic called A Night to Remember, famously said that the Titanic was like, the story of the Titanic was like the last night of a small town. And the Chernobyl accident was literally that, because it affected all of the 50,000 people or more who lived in the town, and they all had to be spirited away from their homes at extremely short notice, and the place became a ghost town afterwards. So, and I think that partly because of that, you know, it was also similar to the Titanic sinking in that it affected a whole cross-section of Soviet society, from President Gorbachev at the very top to individual firefighters who were summoned to fight the effects of the explosion and the fire in the aftermath of the first alarms going out. And it showed all of those people at their best and their worst in the way that catastrophes like this can. So I think there's an awful lot about it that has kind of enduring fascination for people. I mean, one of the most extraordinary stories that I came across was the first person that I spoke to when I first went to Russia and Ukraine back in 2006, because I originally started work on the story in order to do a magazine story to not celebrate, to mark the 20th anniversary of the accident, which took place in 2006. So, and I ended up working on researching the story for 10 or 12 years in total. But the first person that I met in Moscow right at the beginning of 2006 was Alexander Yevchenko and his wife Natalia. And Alexander had been at work inside the reactor building at the moment the reactor exploded. And it was really the story that he began to tell me that day in Moscow that I found so astonishing. More importantly, I think the fact that he was still alive 20 years later to tell me what he'd witnessed, I found so remarkable that at that point I thought that there's almost certainly a book in this story. Because one of the most memorable things he described to me was once he eventually found his way outside the ruined building in the minutes after the explosion took place, he described seeing this ethereal pillar of blue-white light reaching upwards from the ruins of the reactor building into the sky and disappearing into infinity. which a number of people was a phenomenon a number of people described, and it was an almost certain indication of the radioactive ionization of air being caused by the fact that there was a nuclear reactor that was uncovered to the outside atmosphere. And when he described that to me, I was just like, "This is I literally can't believe you're sitting here telling me about this." So he was one of them, and I think the other person who really made a huge impression on me was Maria Protsenko, who was the architect, the chief architect for the town, and she oversaw the construction of Pripyat from not from the beginning, but for many years after it was first begun, and remained inside the exclusion zone, supervising first the evacuation of the city, and then helping a lot with the what the Russians called the liquidation, the cleanup of the consequences of the accident. And as a result, not only was she the person who played a significant part in creating the city of Pripyat, but she was the person responsible for going out with a map and staking out the path of the fence that would be built around the city to cordon it off from humanity for the remaining 40 years since then. And her story I found really kind of incredible for that reason. Well, the first part of your question is that there were people who never left the exclusion zone. So there were a lot of people who lived in remote villages around the power plant, which fell within the area that the Soviet authorities decided had to be completely evacuated, who had lived there their entire lives. And they, we're talking about 1986, so many of them had lived through the Second World War when, the Nazis swept through the same area. And they really didn't want to leave. And in fact, there were probably plenty of reasons why they shouldn't have to leave, because the way the border of the exclusion zone was drawn was simply to encompass all of the worst of the radiation hotspots within a certain perimeter around the plant. So although the exclusion zone contained then and still contains a lot of places that are dangerous if you hang around in them, there were huge areas of it that were relatively, I won't say perfectly safe, but that were relatively safe because they weren't that badly contaminated. So a lot of people, when the evacuation took place, evaded the troops that were sent out to conduct this forced evacuation. Some people also left and then just kind of drifted back into the exclusion zone afterwards and returned to their homes. And those people carried on living there for decades. So, even when I last visited the exclusion zone, which was in 2018, I think, there were still these grandmothers who would be living on their own in these kind of otherwise abandoned villages and growing their own fruit and vegetables and keeping, pigs and cows and stuff, and living there apparently quite happily. I don't know where you've read about mutant wolves, and I'm not really sure exactly what that means. And there was a sort of convenient fiction, right, an appealing notion that developed in the decades after the accident took place, that the exclusion zone had become a sort of radioactive Eden, and there were ways in which the animals that lived inside the exclusion zone had somehow adapted to radiation, and so nature had really triumphed over the evils that men had unleashed inside the area by building this reactor and then allowing it to explode. But I spent quite a lot of time with two scientists, Moller and Musso, who spent decades studying this phenomenon of how the radioactive contamination inside the exclusion zone had affected plants and animals that lived there. And I'm afraid that the idea that, that nature had really triumphed over radiation seemed to be largely nonsense from their research. Certainly one of their principal findings was that the exclusion zone, far from a sort of radioactive Eden, had become what they called a giant roach motel, which was like one of these poisonous traps that you put down to attract cockroaches. They go inside and they eat the poisoned food inside the roach motel, and then they die. They never leave. And so there was certainly an element of the exclusion zone where it remained so contaminated in parts that animals would migrate into the exclusion zone from outside, and they would live there for a while, but eventually they would succumb to the effects of radiation and die. And that, the slightly depressing but extremely convincing conclusion that they came to is that, far from triumphing over radiation, what happened was that because there were no people inside the exclusion zone anymore, in the absence of man, animals and plants were able to thrive. Because, before the accident, the Ukrainians in particular were very enthusiastic hunters of all sorts of wild animals, enthusiastic fishermen, and it was also a kind of pretty heavily industrialized zone. So there were collective farms, and there was obviously a whole series of nuclear reactors inside the zone. And so they concluded in the end that really, yes, mankind was a bigger problem for nature than ionizing radiation. So there's different phases really. When the explosion first took place, the plant director was, summoned by a telephone call in the middle of the night and went straight to the reactor building. And I think that he just really couldn't the enormity of the catastrophe that he was facing was such that he really just couldn't process what he was seeing. So for the first few hours, he kind of, in a way, really refused to believe that what was happening was really happening. And he underplayed the scale of the calamity for the first 12 hours that it was happening. So the messages that he sent up to his bosses in Moscow really did not suggest exactly how huge a catastrophe was unfolding in Ukraine. But the authorities in Moscow then sent down, several successive waves of government commissions. And when they arrived, they began to get quite quickly began to get a really good sense of exactly what was going on, but didn't really know how to deal with it, because this is a catastrophe that nobody in the Soviet Union had ever envisaged happening, or indeed preparing to deal with, and for that matter, neither had anybody in the West. So they initially responded to a disaster in just the same way that the Soviet authorities responded to disasters of all other kinds that had taken place in the years before, which was to try and keep it secret. And that was partly just because it was a sort of reflexively paranoid state that wanted to control information as much as possible. But also it was that the nuclear power industry was one of the sort of shining beacons of Soviet science. And they had, spent years telling the rest of the world that they were way ahead of everyone else in nuclear technology. And it was representative of the supremacy of Soviet science. So they couldn't possibly let word of this catastrophe leak out if they could help it, which was one of the reasons they waited 36 hours to evacuate the citizens of Pripyat, simply because they knew if they let these people leave and then go out to different places around the Soviet Union, then there was no way they could control the flow of information. So they threw a police cordon around the town in the hours after the explosion, and then in quick succession cut off the long distance phones and then eventually the local phone lines. So nobody could get in or out, and they couldn't tell anybody what was going on. And they kept the information about what was happening clamped down right up until the point when the cloud of radioactive contamination reached a nuclear power plant in Forsmark in Sweden, which was 800 miles away from Chernobyl. And only when radiation specialists at Forsmark began to discover extremely high levels of radiation being tracked inside the plant from workers arriving at work and setting off radiation monitors inside the plant, did they then raise the alarm that something had happened a long way away somewhere inside the Soviet Union. And only after that did the USSR eventually admit that something had gone wrong. So I would say that Chernobyl was really a kind of a catalyst for the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union. There are obviously a lot of different causes that contributed to what eventually happened. But I think that one of the most important ways in which it helped lead to the fall of the USSR is the effect it had on Mikhail Gorbachev. So Gorbachev had taken power quite recently in the Soviet Union, and when he came to power, he started talking about these two ideas, glasnost and perestroika, so economic reform, and glasnost, which was the idea of open government. But up to the point when the accident took place, glasnost had really just been a slogan. He hadn't really done anything about this. And in the aftermath of the accident, he began actually applying it in the way that he allowed more open reporting of what was going on inside the exclusion zone in the weeks and months after it happened. So he allowed reporters from Pravda, for example, to go down and start interviewing people. And Pravda published stories about what was going on during the cleanup. And in the long run, what happened was that once that kind of openness had begun, if only in small ways, it was followed by magazine stories in which people who worked in the nuclear industry talked about their experience and their background and the reality of accidents. Once that had started, it proved almost impossible to reverse. So this trend towards openness meant that Soviet citizens began to find out more and more about the truth of the way the state had actually worked. And that really undermined their trust in the system. But also, Gorbachev himself, had remained largely ignorant of exactly how rotten the nuclear state was, because the nuclear power industry was regulated by the wider nuclear organizations which govern the manufacture and development of nuclear weapons especially. And although Gorbachev came into power thinking understanding that the Soviet state really needed reform if it was to survive, he had no idea of the scale of it. So when he discovered, as a result of what he found out about Chernobyl and the long path that led to the accident, just how kind of corrupt even the nuclear industry, this kind of the pinnacle of Soviet technology, had been, then he realized quite quickly that the system needed root and branch reform. And Chernobyl convinced him that he needed to plunge into this very deeply and very quickly. And so he, partly in response to that, brought about these economic reforms, which were the real reason that USSR collapsed, because he went about it too quickly and too drastically, and that led to the unraveling of the state. It's extremely unlikely, because Chernobyl happened because of a series of circumstances and technologies that really only existed in the USSR in 1986. So the type of reactor that they were building at Chernobyl and the type of reactor that exploded at Chernobyl only existed inside the borders of the USSR. And then after the accident, the nuclear industry, the nuclear authorities in the Soviet Union very quickly modified and changed the reactor to avoid the sort of technological problems with the reactor that contributed towards the accident, in a way that made it extremely hard for it to be repeated. So this kind of accident, certainly on this scale, could never happen in another reactor like that again. And so, would it be dealt with in a different way? Well, it wouldn't happen in the first place. And I think a lot of the concerns about Zaporizhia, are of a different kind of nuclear accident, which is if the Russians, strike it with missiles or artillery fire, and therefore seriously damage one of the reactors, and so there's a radioactive leak. But could there be a massive steam explosion like the one that there was that destroyed reactor number 4 in Chernobyl? Almost certainly not. But Chernobyl itself remains a real problem because, in the years after the fall of the Soviet Union, the other European nations came together and spent billions of dollars to build what they called the new safe confinement, which was this huge building over the top of the ruins of reactor number 4, which would enable them to not only seal off any further radioactive leaks from the ruins, but also gradually dismantle and decontaminate the site. And that was only completed in, I think, 2017 or 2018. But last year, the Russians deliberately targeted it with an explosive drone and punched a massive hole in the roof, destroying the way that it was supposed to work, and meaning that, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of repairs have to be conducted on it to make it start working again. I think initially one of the things that surprised me most was, as I said, was the fact that there were so many people who were eyewitnesses to what had happened, who, were not only still alive 20 or 30 years later, but many of them were still working in the nuclear industry. So there was one guy, Boris Stolyachuk, who was in the reactor control room on the night of the accident, who I interviewed at some length about what he had seen and witnessed. And he was working for the Ukrainian Nuclear Regulatory Authority when I met him in 2016. And as I say, Alexander Yevchenko was still alive 20 years after the accident happened. So I think even people who received these doses of radiation that, at the time of the accident were regarded as a certain death sentence, proved amazingly kind of resilient in the face of what they'd suffered. So that, I think, was one of the most surprising things. Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty good suggestion. I think it would be fascinating to sit down and talk to Anatoly Dyatlov, not only because of, his central place in what happened on the night of the accident, but also because of his background. He was someone who had spent his entire professional career working on nuclear reactors, both in the extremely secret military side of the Soviet industry, but also in Chernobyl. And he seemed like a kind of a formidable but a fascinating character who certainly was not the moustache twirling villain that he's been portrayed as in some ways that the story has been told. So either him or Leonid Topsanov, who was the senior reactor control engineer who was responsible for actually pressing the scram button that was the initiating cause of the explosion. He was only in his early 20s at the time, and I would love to know what his experience was really like, and how he felt about his life in the nuclear industry before the accident happened. I mean, that idea that there was going to be, I think that the half of Europe uninhabitable thing, that was a concern that some of the physicists who were working at the site in the days, weeks, and months after the initial explosion took place had, which was that there was a way in which there could be a second steam explosion caused within the ruins of the reactor, and that would act like a sort of an enormous dirty bomb. And the explosion could be large enough to not only destroy the ruins of reactor 4, but also encompass the other 3 reactors that were also at the site and built very close to reactor number 4. And that would liberate this huge amount of physical debris into the atmosphere, and that would settle as fallout in the areas around northern Ukraine and in Belarus and in Russia, and then spread further. And that contamination would, make large areas of those countries uninhabitable. But in the end, that proved not to be the case, and it's an open question whether an explosion like that could have taken place, or indeed, if it had, whether it would have been so enormous that it would have created all of this fallout. The myth part, the thing that's unquestionably a myth, is that that this would be a nuclear explosion, like the explosion, the detonation of a nuclear bomb, which is the way that it's been talked about in some places, and that, that was just beyond the laws of physics, basically. But there's a lot of myths that have developed, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to write the book in the first place, is because there've been so much misinformation, disinformation, and myth making that had developed in the years after the accident, that I wanted to write an account that was, that reflected the truth of what happened, because in many cases the kind of truth was even more astonishing than the myth. So, another one of these ideas is this idea of the bridge of death, which is where a lot of people from Pripyat were supposed to have gone in the middle of the night, minutes after this massive explosion had taken place, had got out of bed and like taken their children in strollers and pushchairs out to this bridge from which they had an excellent view of the reactor building as it burned, and stood there watching for hours. And as they did so, were blanketed by an almost invisible curtain of fallout. And all of those people who stood on the bridge that night died, in the weeks afterwards. And that's just total nonsense. I mean, these were the relatives of people who worked at a nuclear power plant. So if they knew that there was an explosion inside a nuclear reactor, would they really go out and take their kids out to just have a good look at this kind of amazing firework display? I don't think so. I did speak to members of the KGB. I mean, the truth is that inside the Soviet Union, people didn't have to be told to keep quiet about what happened, because that was the culture of the Soviet Empire. It was only a couple of decades since, under Stalin, people had been regularly disappeared in the middle of the night and never seen again, or taken away and shot because of perceived slights against the state, let alone disclosing classified information. And the civilian nuclear industry, so the nuclear power generation industry, was regarded as being, almost exactly the same as the nuclear weapons industry, in which everything was top secret. So people weren't supposed to. No, they knew they weren't supposed to talk about things that went on. But the KGB played a central role in trying to cover up the causes of what happened, and that's no more clearly apparent than in the list that was circulated within the KGB and within the Ministry of Media and Machine Building, which is what the cover name given to the military side of the nuclear state, in the months afterwards, which was a list of priorities about the Chernobyl accident after it happened. And literally at the top of the list, number one was, we must not reveal the causes of what happened. This is a list of things that were to be kept secret. Number one was the real causes of the Chernobyl accident. Oh, I've never heard that. I mean, that sounds very similar to something that they did actually do when they presented the report to the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna in, I'm not sure of the date now, July '86, I think. So the Soviet authorities, wanted to certainly make it look as though they were being completely open about what had happened. And so they presented this report, an extremely detailed and well presented report, to their nuclear colleagues in the IAEA a few months after it happened. And that report, it was a massaging of the truth. They scapegoated the operators of the reactor and blamed them entirely for what went wrong, and really just attempted to cover up the fact that a lot of the reasons the accident took place were in the fact that the reactor itself was poorly designed. So certainly human error was involved, but the reactor was so badly designed with a series of design faults that they knew about for years before the accident took place. Whether or not the operators were competent, an accident was almost always going to happen.